ideas rich, so we'll open it up directly for questions. Pam.
I have a question to Dr. Pettis. You talked about like China experience in the transition, which is really difficult, or maybe will be difficult and long. My question is, what do you think, or do you have any ideas that can help China to make this transition less pay or feel better, get over this transition?
I often get a variation of that question, which is, if you were a policymaker, what would you do? Funny because Don Carlos is the optimist and I'm the pessimist, but there wasn't a lot of difference. I think maybe there's a difference of attitude about how we look at the same stuff, because I agree that China's not going to collapse. My argument is that for the next decade, we're going to see, I think we're probably going to be happy to see in the next 5 years, 6% growth rates. And we're still living through this great demographic sweet spot, which sort of reverses. And so after that, we'll probably see even lower growth rates. It's just going to be a slow grinding process as we work through the type of non-performing loan problems that Professor Beim was discussing.
Could I take advantage of this good question and ask each of our panelists if they wish to comment on what policies each think that China should undertake?
I'll be happy to take a crack at that. I mentioned briefly at the end of my remarks, I would have said more, but I was running out of time, that there is a distinction between the enterprises that are state-owned and largely concentrated in the eastern part of the country and those in the rural part of China. So back in the 1980s, there was a very vibrant growth of businesses in the rural area. The township and village enterprises were a vigorous source of China's growth. In fact, that was most of China's growth during the 1980s. The emphasis on coastal development, export orientation, and urban has been a creature of the 1990s. And that has just come up relatively recently. The problem with that model is not only that the export-driven growth may be unsustainable, but it's also that the state-owned enterprises are not efficient users of capital. The township and village enterprises were much more efficient users of capital, and there's a number of academic studies that have made that clear, including one from our Columbia colleague, Shanjin Wei. So if I were doing policy, I think I would try to reorient the flow of capital away from the state-owned enterprises and try and reinvigorate the rural part of China. That's, if there is social unrest in China, that's where it is. And I think it is time to rebalance. I also believe that that's what the current leadership in China is trying to do. So the good news is that, for example, the consumption growth in the first 3 months has been high, 16% consumption increase in China in the first quarter. The growth in the second-tier cities has been faster than the growth in the first-tier cities, and the growth in the third-tier cities has been faster than the growth in the second-tier cities. So consumption patterns are starting to shift, and that suggests, I think, a reorientation of policy towards rural China, which is, I think, should be the #1 priority of the Chinese government. If I were unlucky enough to be in charge of Chinese policy, if you were lucky enough to have me there, that's what I would try to do.
Do others wish to comment? It's not obligatory.
I would like to just to add again, I also ran out of time, but in terms of addressing the imbalance, I think as economists we have a lot of wish lists, but of course as politicians or policymakers they have different set of constraints. But there are difficult things to do, for example, raising resource taxes and energy prices that probably are not, or asking SOEs to pay more dividends. Probably very hard to push right now during a downturn where corporate are hurting, but there are policies right now, for example, increasing the labor-intensive industries development, which can help generate more employment and need much less capital and are much less damaging to the environment, are both good policies for the short term and the medium term, and that probably face less political constraint in this environment, and government need, for example, to break down the entrance barriers for non-state companies in these sectors, and also including developing the financial sector so that both corporate and household can borrow from the credit market more easily than just the SOEs. So these are some of the policies I think the government could give a bigger push.
I think it's enough to just have economists and the Western to role play Chinese officials, and the bankers should just stay off that one.
I think we'll have, here what I'm going to do is, because time is short, I'm going to collect a couple of questions. So I'd like to have yours, sir, and then Frank.
Hi, my question is has to do with currency appreciation. It seems that production and consumption imbalance would be very easily or helped in Chinese currency appreciation. So any predictions about that, how it will affect the current situation?
This is a subject that all wise men avoid, and women. But let's see if this panel is brave enough. But let's collect a couple of more observations and questions.
Yeah, I really appreciate this very clear presentation of all four of you. But I can't help but challenge those two policy suggestions by both Professor Beim and Dr. Wang. Because I think the assumptions may be problematic. I don't have the data. Professor Beim's assumption is that TBE are efficient, but isn't the TBE also a sector that actually has a lot to do with export too? Export. China's export is driven a lot by TBEs, not necessarily by the state sector. So in that sense, that if we really put a lot of attention to the TBE, how do we solve this production problem necessarily? You're looking at the efficient side, maybe that's true, but what about the other side? Dr. Wang also assumes that labor-intensive industries, again, maybe also TBEs, could be better off in terms of hiring more people, but also he says something about environmentally sound. I don't know where that assumption is, where I thought that TBE could be very polluting. So those are two assumptions that could challenge those suggestions.
Final point for our consideration over here, please. Could the microphone go to the right?
Thank you. My question is, in theory, it looks like, for example, this imbalance between the debt, the consumption, the investment will make the economic growth unsustainable. But in reality, for example, in real estate industry, everybody knows that China's income level is much lower than the price currently it is. Okay, the current price is maybe more than 15 times of the annual income of each household. However, in reality, this has been the fact for the past 10 years. So my question here is how to solve this problem. Do you have any insight, for example, why this theory and reality is so different?
Thank you very much. I think I'd like to invite the panelists each to have 1 minute to comment on this rich array and the challenge of answering these questions.
I'm just going to address the first one, the currency issue, because it's sort of, there's a whole package of issues there. One of the mistakes we make is to think that trade policies are currency policies or tariffs. They're not. Anything that affects the gap between production and consumption is by definition a trade policy, because the trade surplus or deficit is that gap. And this is sort of the problem that policymakers face, which also addresses the earlier question. There are a whole bunch of things that can be done in the long term that would help the transition. Interest rates should go up. The currency should appreciate. Wages should go up. Lots of things should be happening. But unfortunately, many of the things that help the transition over the medium to long term make employment problems worse off in the beginning. So that's why we have this big debate about the currency. Some people are arguing that the currency should actually depreciate to help the export sector. This type of argument is being repeated over and over again in a whole bunch of different areas, including interest rates and wages, et cetera, et cetera. And I always remind people that the United States in 1930-31, we faced a very similar problem, and we mismanaged it. We addressed our excess production problem by raising tariffs. And that was supposed to address our unemployment problem at home, but it did so by making the international problem worse. I've argued that China also has its smoot-hawley with Chinese characteristics. Most of the policies aimed at addressing the problem are aimed at addressing the short-term unemployment problem, but they're actually making the overall imbalance worse, which means we're just going to have a more difficult adjustment going forward. So the currency issue is sort of a, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm so jet-lagged, I can't speak. But it's an example of the dilemma facing the government. Do we appreciate or do we depreciate? There are arguments for either side.
The currency issue is just a reflection of all macro policies on both China and internationally. In the end, in China, I think the currency is a political decision. Whether that is the root cause of the imbalance, I don't think so, but it's a big part of it, because it also is part of the distortion of relative factor prices, which helps to keep capital relatively cheap in China, which therefore fosters growth of capital-intensive industry. But China has the biggest endowment in China is people. We have 1.3 billion people. Should we really be exporting capital to the rest of the world? So that really means we have some structural distortions in our structure. And so, come to the second question, I don't necessarily mean that we should develop TVEs or small enterprise. I'm saying we should develop labor-intensive industries, especially services. And the services industries, by definition, is relatively less energy, less pollution. So that there's a lot of details about that. Finally, on the real estate, people look at the average income, average housing price, and assume that nobody can afford it. Just one thing: it's not the average income people in China that are buying properties. It's the upper middle income people. If you look at their income, the multiples are not nearly as high, because that's not possible. So that's why there's a dilemma. And the solution is actually, if you want to increase ownership of homes to normal people, then supply normal type of properties, not the high-end ones that only rich people can afford. Thank you.
I'd also like to address the foreign exchange question because it has been so much in the news. I think too much so. My view is that foreign exchange is dramatically overestimated as a factor in the imbalance between China and the United States. I don't think it had very much to do with the imbalance, and I don't think that changing the exchange rate by an amount by which you could reasonably change it would by itself make the difference. So I really don't think it's that relevant. And I'm sorry that our policymakers seem to be so stuck on that issue. I think it has to do with perceptions in the Congress of the United States, which are false perceptions. And I feel badly that that has gotten in the way of relationships between our two countries because I think it's just technically wrong. So I would hope that we could get our minds off of currency. If you ask me where I think the currency should be, if I were China, I would let the currency appreciate, because then you get paid more for your goods. I think if you do have a somewhat undervalued currency, I don't know by how much, but that means that you are selling your goods at a lower price than they would otherwise command. So I think in your own self-interest, you would want to raise the price of your goods. Now that may be hard to do in the face of a trade downturn. This is a tough time to be making that adjustment, but I've been saying that for a good 5 or 10 years to my Chinese friends, is that really, you should be paid more. And you should want to be paid more, but I think we should not try to make you do that, because frankly, the United States has benefited from this policy, unreasonably so.
I will only just quickly address the housing issue. Obviously, the housing issue in China is a structure issue, and it's also based on the fundamental problem of China being a nation where land is still, a property of scarcity, and that means that we will have a long housing problem, for many, many years to come. And the reason we have the current problems, there are many reasons, but obviously the fact that the local government owns the land and have a huge interest in making sure the land are maintained at very high price levels because they're relying on them for fiscal revenue. That is a structure issue that unless that can be changed, housing prices will remain at very high levels for a long time, only for the very top end of the population. But if you go to Hong Kong, or places like Hong Kong, you have people living in real little tiny spaces, but they seem to be okay because that's their way of resolving a housing issue. And I think China today, the government is not faced with tremendous pressure to change the structure issues yet, simply because if you look at China's population as a pyramid, only the top end of it has a strong desire to live in good solid houses. The expectation of the massive population is yet still growing, is still being kept. I think one day when people really start to feel that's a social rights issue, it's an entitlement issue, then we're going to have a big crisis to come. So we really need to understand that issue and trying to really create a more sustainable system to provide land for housing. That will be a long-term solution for that problem.
I think any good discussion leaves you hungry for more time, and certainly this discussion is one wonderful example. But we must move to a very short coffee break before resuming. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.